it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Rebel Brown, who has helped me overcome myself. Today, we talk about how our minds look at the world and how we may need to change the lens we see life through so we can be more powerful. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. Today's quote comes from Epictetus. Keep your attention focused entirely on what is truly your own concern, and be clear that what belongs to others is their business and none of yours. If you do this, you will be impervious to coercion, and no one can ever hold you back. You will be truly free and effective, for all your efforts will be put to good use and won't be foolishly squandered, finding fault with or opposing others. In knowing and attending to what actually concerns you, you cannot be made to do anything against your will. Others can't hurt you, and you don't incur enemies or suffer harm. If you aim to live by such principles, remember that it won't be easy. You must give up some things entirely and postpone others from now. You may well have to forego wealth and power if you want to assure the attainment of happiness and freedom. Wow, that's a tough decision, giving up wealth and power to have happiness and freedom. Doesn't have to be so. We can find harmony in life. And to do so, we need to be intentional with what we do. We're going to talk a lot about that in today's episode. At the core is examining ourselves to make the changes in the way we look at the world. These things sound simple, but they're difficult to do. And the first step is to create the space and time to be able to think and examine ourselves. Mindset is the core driver for having what you want in life. Our guest today, who spent over 25 years in high technology consulting as a recognized market, product, strategist, and turnaround expert. She was named one of the top 100 women in computing. As a consultant, she has worked with over 200 global organizations to help them create strategies to go to market, lead and sell more effectively for profitable market advantage. They call her everything from the Texas tornado to the Energizer Bunny to their secret weapon. She's a best-selling author of The Influential Leader, which offers practical applications of psychology to business and leadership. Her strategy book, Defy Gravity, is a leader's guide to go-to-market strategies that increase bottom-line profitability. She blogs at Revelations. She is also the founder and director of the Unstoppable You Foundation, a nonprofit program committed to guiding kids to know what they are born to be, unstoppable. Rebel is also a board-certified instructor of a variety of neuro and behavioral scientific methods, including a trainer of master hypnotherapists, a certified master trainer and coach, a trainer of neurolinguistics, a master coach of quantum mind shifting, a level 1 Epona equine therapist, and a certified cognitive coach, and much more. Let's meet our guest. Welcome to Rich Your Soul, Rebel Brown. It's great to have you join us today.
It is great to be here, Rocky. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you so much for all you've done to me, and I am excited about our conversation.
Better be careful, Rocky. You talk to people about me doing things to you, and that may not come off right. How about with you?
With me. There you go. For me, right? Life happens for me, not to me.
Yes, it does.
Let's start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
I grew up in a very small town in the Midwest, in the Ohio River Valley, and I was the only child of two parents who were only children, who had me at 42 and 41. 1958 was pretty unusual. I grew up in a small town with a very tight-knit farming community, and I kind of was raised by probably 8 sets of parents because my parents were so old when they had me. All of their friends had kids that were teenagers now. So I was raised with all these adults as my parents who were all depression children, right? And so for me, money was something that was scarce. There was only a limited supply to go around that everybody was competing for. And I also, one of the other things I learned through my life is that money was something that I had to earn, and I had to work really hard and struggle to get. And that learning, as we will talk, that learning really was something, those early childhood learnings had tremendous impacts on how I looked at my reality as an adult. And once I changed those learnings, those biases, it was amazing what changed in my life with regard to money and with many other things. Because, when you're raised with a scarcity feeling about money, it kind of filters over to everything else in your life. Everything is scarce. Everything is limited. And there's one pie and it's one size and we all are competing for it. And, the reality is that's not even close to truth.
No, it's not. There's a pretty big pie out there and it's ever growing. And the more you put into it, the bigger it gets and the more there is to share.
And the more you expect it to expand, the more it expands. Because as we are going to talk about, we are really we create our reality. We are quantum computers in our brains that literally what we focus on, what we believe, and what we expect is what we get. And the ancients and the esoterics have said that for centuries, millenniums. But neuroscience and the sciences in our modern world have now proven that that's actually the case. So we're at an interesting time when what has been poo-pooed as woo-woo, et cetera, with everything from The Secret to the law of attraction to, if you go into ancient esoteric sciences, what you expect, what you focus on is what you get is basically a lot of their theory. We now can prove with science, with quantum biologists are proving it. It's amazing what we're learning. So we are actually these amazingly powerful beings that become limited by how we're programmed, our experiences, what we're taught, which all create our biases, which is what we're going to talk about, right? And when we step past that, we literally are limitless, Rocky. As you know, I know you believe that. I know that. I've experienced that. So many people in my world that I've been able to share with and support, and they've experienced that. And I think today, especially in our world today, it's really important that we all keep an eye on that and really come to learn that, because there's a lot of symptoms in our world today that are about that belief that there's only so much to go around and we have to fight and scrap to get it. And that's not the case at all. This world constantly expands based on what we expect.
That is very, very true. I guess we should probably start kind of at the beginning. When you say biases, what do you mean by that?
Bias is one of those words that's now become popular, and we've all been taught that we have bias, and we equate something to racism as a bias, which is a really negative example. We've been taught that biases are these things that we can consciously know about, like, oh, I have a bias against black cars, the things that I dislike, right? Bias is so much more than that, and we haven't been taught that. Let me give you an example. Everything we think or do is driven by a bias to keep us safe. Everything we think or do is driven by a bias to drive us towards safety. Nobody's ever told us that, and yet that's how we're wired. What they really are is they're selected interpretations of our reality. They're the way we interpret our reality. They're created by our unconscious minds. They are designed to protect us from threats and keep us safe. And by the way, they were designed to be our friends, to be our protection mechanisms, our supporters. But in today's world, they're not our friends anymore. They're anything but. I'll give you a great example. We can be standing next to someone, and because of our biases, we will not experience the same reality. None of us experience the same reality at any point in time. We are all living in our individual realities. And I'll give you an example. Have you ever been at a sporting event? Let's say you're for one team and somebody else is for the other team, and you're friends. And there's a foul called at the event, and it's against your team. And you say it was the worst call ever, and your friend sees it totally as correct, and you can stand there and talk about it, and you both have valid arguments about why your perspective is true, but it's as if you both saw a different play in the game. Have you ever had that happen?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's bias in action. That is a really simple example of bias in action, because biases literally interpret the data that we take in from our world to make it look like what we expect in our reality so that we are safe. The biases filter out anything that counters what we expect or is different what we expect or would threaten what we expect, so that we literally live in a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's what we see in our reality.
And that probably explains why you can have multiple kids grow up in the same household and they're all different.
Right, because none of them had exactly the same experiences. Here's the thing. Before we're 7 or 8 years old, and it depends on the kid, everything that happens to us, everything we're told, every experience, every statement is taken as truth. Children do not have what's known as a critical faculty, which is the part of your brain that develops to tell you true from false, right? They don't have that. We develop that somewhere between 7, 8, 9 years old, depending on the child. So everything that occurred to one brother versus another brother builds how their unconscious mind sees their world, what they believe is true, and creates their bias. Right? And it's not like one big bias. There are all kinds of different biases. For example, if one brother is told that he's an athlete and is going to be a star basketball player because he grows very quickly, and another brother is told that he's a shrimp and uncoordinated, the brother that's told he's a shrimp and uncoordinated will develop a bias that says that that is true, especially if it's repetitive, and will never be able to see himself as an athlete. And believe it or not, it can even impact how his cells develop in his body. Whereas the brother that was told he's going to be a superstar basket player because he starts out long and lean will believe it, and he will have a bias that he can do that. And now here's another kicker. So none of us have those same experiences, right? How many of us have walked in exactly the same experiences 24/7 through our entire lives? None of us. After we're children, we still continue to develop the biases. We just have a foundation of them that we tend to expand on and leverage off of, right? But now here's a kicker. A research study came out a few years back. They followed children from the time they entered school until they entered high school, okay? And what they learned is that children, by teachers, this is only with teachers, were told they can't 150,000 times, and they were told they can 5,000 times. 30-1 programming that you can't, you're limited, you can't. And you wonder why we lose sight of the power we have, right? This world programs us from coming in as these amazing creatures with the ability to create our own reality, select our reality, etc. We teach bias, we teach limitation, we pass down bias, And suddenly we limit our children, and you wonder why. I don't know about you, but I wondered why. My parents raised me that I could do anything, and yet my environment didn't. And so I always had this conflict of the first thing that came to me is I'm not good enough. I don't fit in. I don't match. That's what we're taught. That is a bias. And it's not true. And yet many of us have it because it was imprinted in our childhood. It was experiential. How we got there is very different, but it's a common bias.
That's very true. And if you think about it, when you have young kids, I would bet the average parent says no 50-1 to saying yes, right? Can I do this? No. Can I do that? No. Can you do no. It's rare that you have parents that say yes, yes, yes.
And you know what? Some of our biases are good. So for example, the bias to not put your hand on a burning stove is a really protected bias. That's why many of our biases are lessons that we learn to protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe, because that's the primary fundamental goal of your brain, of your unconscious mind, which really is the master of your brain, not your conscious mind. And we'll get into that. But the primary goal of that is to keep you safe, to look for threats, to keep you safe. And so therefore, the idea that a bias of don't touch that hot stove, don't walk in front of a car, don't pick up a rattlesnake, those are really good biases and you want them. The challenge is when they filter over and start to filter what you see as your reality when it comes to things that really aren't threatening, right? And yet your brain sees them as threats. And here's kind of how that works. So one of our, let's take, one of the strongest inherent biases we have is to safety, right? And that was developed in caveman time because nobody wanted, cavemen needed to be safe. So they didn't want to go running out by themselves to chase a woolly mammoth, right? Or take on a saber-toothed tiger. For many reasons. A, it was not safe for them, but losing a member of the clan would hurt the clan as well, right? Because you only have so many and you want to band together for strength. So that was wired into us as we developed as humans, right? And in that day and age, there was probably a threat to our safety, maybe once a week, once a day, but it wasn't a constant threat. It was an exception to our existence, to our normal life, right? Now, fast forward to today, where we live in a world of constant threat, right? And by the way, it's not just major threats. The news is a threat, right? The news, you read the news and there's threatening things all around us. Any change is seen as a threat by your unconscious mind. So the change all around us, the chaos, the potential for change, the unknown, we are literally bombarded with constant threat responses, right? That trigger our bias to safety. And as a result, we're wired to handle a set of circumstances and protect ourselves and keep ourselves safe from a time frame where that was an exception to the rule, versus today that same wiring is in place where change, threat, chaos, everything around us is constant. So we're sitting here with a totally different set of circumstances than what we were wired to actually function in. And, one of the things I say, it's kind of like trying to send a mission to Mars with an abacus, right? We are literally in conflict about how we're wired versus our reality today. And it's become even more and more of a problem the more chaotic the world gets. And the big kicker out of all of that, aside from the conflict and the wiring, is that change is viewed as a huge threat in our inherent wiring. And we don't even know that. We don't even know that we are wired to move away from change, to avoid change at all costs, any change, right? It's totally unconscious. So now think about what happens in an environment when suddenly your bias prevents you from seeing the opportunities within change because it immediately kicks in and selects a reality that drives you back to safety.
And that's very true. We all want to stay in our patterns. And if you look at people, some people are very pattern driven. They don't change at all, where there's other people who either they've learned or their nature is such that they're okay with change and they move towards it. And then there's those thrilling people who are totally into change, and we look at them and go, wow, they're a little crazy, right?
Yeah, see, that's me. My friends all just look at me and go, you are insane, because I'm fearless. But that's because my parents raised me and programmed me to be fearless. And once I learned how to get past what was imprinted on me by my, let's call it the society around me, which was a very very conservative, fear-driven, fit in the box and stay there, right? Society. Once I moved past that, I realized my mother instilled in me the belief that I can do anything and I could try anything. And she supported that. But this goes back to the differences in our reality, right? So all of our lessons are different. All of our experiences are different from one day to the next. Even sitting in the same meeting, we have a different experience because it builds on what we've already built as a baseline of who we are. So, but because our experiences are different, our biases are different. And that's why what's safe for one person isn't safe for another. That's why you'll see us respond differently to the same kind of situation. And some of us will be threatened and some of us won't. It's why some people are seen as risk takers and are able to grab opportunities and change in chaos and thrive, and why others freeze and can't move. It's because of the differences in the way of our experiences, because our biases are built by our experiences over time. There's some biases that are inherent. There are instincts or biases. So fight or flight is an instinct that is a bias to run, and everybody thinks that's the safety mechanism. That's only one of them, right? There's a bias with herds. Here's a really interesting thing, Rocky, about bias with herds. So have you ever noticed in a group? So you have a group of people and somebody comes up with a new idea that's totally radical, rebellious. Let's use rebellious. I love that. And they step outside of the group and they present this totally innovative concept. And they're really excited. And whoever's the sleeper leader of the group, because there's always somebody that really is the leader, even if it's not the manager, comments and says, well, are you sure you want to do that? Well, we don't want to do that because of blah, blah, blah. And it's usually the reasons are usually status quo, hanging on, right? And the person that had the innovative idea suddenly starts to deflate. And before you know it, they're back in agreeing with the group, and that sparkle in their eye and that idea has disappeared. Have you ever seen that happen?
It happens all the time.
Happens all the time, right? It's one of the problems with innovation. Well, let me tell you what's going on in the mind about that. The herd instinct, which comes from, we talk about it in animals, but it comes in caveman. Did I want somebody in a caveman environment to take off by themselves? No, because it was dangerous for them and it diminished the power of the clan. So literally our safety bias when we're in a group is wired in a way that when we step away from that group to disagree with it, to come up with a new idea, to change, the same chemical that is triggered by somebody pointing a gun at your head is triggered when you step away from that group. Obviously not the same amount of that chemical, but it's the same chemical cocktail as you get in fight or flight. So you are now out there standing on your own, and that chemistry that tells you to flee, right, or fight, and most of it's flee, is happening to you. Somebody counters you from the group. That chemistry drives you back to the group, and as soon as you re-enter the group, your brain gives you a shot of dopamine, which is the bliss chemical. So now you're back in the group and you're happy and blissed out. So what do you do the next time you have an innovative idea?
You stay quiet.
You stay quiet and you stay in the group. Absolutely. You know what amazes me? I was astounded when I learned all of this. I got into this because of my own personal challenges. But as I started to unfold, the science behind all of this, it literally blew my mind, because we are not the logical, rational, conscious decision makers we've all been taught we are. Our unconscious mind filters all of our data, presents that data as a reality, not only filters it, but literally selects specific data to give to our conscious mind that supports our bias to keep us safe and in the status quo and not change.
How much data are we actually filtering? What does that look like?
You know what? This is what really hooked me. I'm glad you asked that, Rocky, because I do a lot of work in high tech, biotech. I've been a consultant there for decades. And one of the questions I kept asking myself is, why is it I walk into startup technology, for example, or early stage, and these guys are brilliant. They're brilliant. I mean, they're brilliant executives. They're brilliant technologists. And yet I walk in an hour, see things they don't see that are right in front of their faces, right? Literally right in front of them, the opportunities, and they don't see them. And it blew my mind for so long. Well, here's why. I finally got my answer, and it came from quantum biology. So the quantum biologists have now been able to measure how our brain takes in data and processes it. And here it is in a really simple form. I mean, you can get into really detailed things, but here's basically what it is. Your brain takes in 11 million bits of data a second. 11 million bits a second. And that comes from your senses. It comes from your sight, your smell, your sound, your touch, your taste if you're eating, right? So your senses bring all that data in. And if you want to think about that, let me give you a kind of a relative way to think about it. Think of a boxes of toothpicks a mile high. So you just tacked boxes of toothpicks a mile high, and that's how much data your brain takes in every second, okay? Now, your unconscious mind filters that data, not your conscious mind, okay? So your unconscious mind filters that data using bias. It uses your instinctual biases. It uses your experiential biases. And what it does is it filters out anything that doesn't meet or match those biases, those expectations, all right, based on your unique experience. And technically what it does is it deletes it, it distorts it, or it generalizes it. So deleting it, it literally throws away the data. It distorts it by making it appear the way you want it to appear, not the way it really is. And it generalizes it so it fits into whatever bucket you have. All right. Now, here's the kicker. Here's the thing that blew me away. 11 million bits of data. Your unconscious mind selects, you ready for this? 127 bits out of the 11 million every second. It selects one box of toothpicks from that mile-high stack. And that is what it gives your conscious mind as your reality. That's 0.00005% of your potential data. And as a data scientist, let me tell you what that question that brought up to me and the realization it brought up to me. How many other realities are in that 99 point, that all the rest of that data that you threw away, how many other realities live there? How many other options for your life live there that you literally are unable to see because your bias filters it so you can't see it? Welcome to quantum mechanics, many worlds theory, Rocky. And that's why I say we're quantum machines, because we literally are filtering this massive amount of potential data and selecting this tiny, tiny little sliver to continue our self-fulfilling prophecies of what we know to be true and safe.
We'll be back with Rebel in a moment. Think about this. What are you missing in your life because you filtered it out? The reason a coach provides so much value and can literally propel you massively forward is because they are seeing the obvious that you are missing. Did you notice how Rebel mentioned walking into companies and the group of executives can't see the opportunity? It's normal. It's what happens to us, and why having someone from the outside who sees things differently can help you achieve more. I work with small business owners to put profit first in their business so they can have the fuel to be able to step back out of the grind and see the bigger picture. We work through the harmony of the business in their personal lives. It's literally life-changing. Would you like someone to look at you through an entirely different filter and see the power you can have to make massive change in your life? Reach out. See if we're a good fit. It's rocky@richersoul.com. If it's not me, then find the person who can help you. Now, let's get back to our amazing conversation with Rebel. if our biases are causing us to ignore so much, and I see this in people, you see it like husband and wife have a conversation, and the wife tells the husband the same thing 100 times, and he doesn't hear her. And then the next door neighbor tells him the same thing. And all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread just occurred. How do we change our attention to be able to not be driven, to be more open to what's going on around us, to look at more than just that small sliver, to see all the other opportunities? Because if you could see all those opportunities, life would be amazing.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about some of those techniques. Do you want to talk about them now?
We don't have to get into the techniques, I guess, but
let's talk about the concept. Let's talk about the theory.
Yes, let's talk about the theory.
Here's the thing. You are never going to pick more than 127 bits, at least not in this time frame, because that's the way the mechanics work. It's like a computer with a data model. It's got 11 million bits of data and it picks 127 because that's how the program works, right? However, here's how I look at bias, all right? So bias drives us to select our reality. We've understood that, right? It teaches us and it drives us to ignore important information, right? Because it's keeping us safe. It's kind of like the guardrails that protect us, right? But the problem is in this world, they're not guardrails. They're barriers that keep us from seeing opportunities, right? So the trick is, how do I recognize where I have bias? And how do I teach my brain a different truth about that bias? I'm going to call bias truth. So let me give you an example from my life. Okay. So I've been a consultant. I mentioned this. I've been a consultant for 40 years in high tech and biotech. And my early years, I was hell on wheels. I had somebody tell me one day when I walked into a room, I sucked all the air out because the energy was so big. Right. And I had this, everybody on the outside would have thought that I was absolutely self-assured, confident, you name it, right? Because I was just going for everything. And I was one of those, I was the first woman in every company I worked for, and I was going to prove how good I was, right? And everybody thought I had total confidence, skills, and nobody would have believed I was insecure. I went home at night and sobbed my eyes out every day because I thought I wasn't good enough, right? There's an example of what I actually was experiencing and demonstrating in my reality was totally different than what was going on inside me. And at the time, I didn't realize that I thought that's how life was. I didn't know any different. I didn't realize that what was going on there was a bias that was so strong about myself being not good enough, not worthy. That bias, which people call insecurity, was created by my childhood. Once I understood that bias was created by my childhood and what caused it, the first step is always recognize that it's a bias. Recognize that it is not actually true. And some of the ways you can do that is, one of the things I tell people to do to find a bias is every time you make a statement. So, for example, if you make a statement like, I can't do that, or we can't do that, or we'll never be able to succeed there, just things that you just know, stop. Ask yourself why you believe that. Start asking questions. Questions open your mind to other options. Questions in a team open the team's mind to other options. Statements narrow just to the statement, right? So anytime you make a strong statement or you have a strong feeling about what you absolutely know to be true, ask yourself why you believe it. Start to ask yourself questions. Start to ask questions that make you look at the other side of what if it isn't true? What are the other options? So I'm not good enough. Why do you believe that? Well, because I'm not. Well, where's the evidence of that? Because of the way I feel. Okay, so why do you feel that? Because you feel insecure that everybody else thinks you're not good enough. Has anybody said anything? No. Have you ever been chastised for not being good enough? No. When you start to use your conscious mind to analyze and break apart the unconscious bias, you find the bias and you can start then to change the bias, because literally what you focus on, what you repeat to yourself. Your unconscious mind's a learning machine, and it's a repetitive learning machine. So the way to change a bias is to pivot to the opposite belief of the bias and literally focus on that reality, and that will start to change your own bias. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Because I coached with kids, I found a little 3-letter word that changes everything when it comes to biases. And that word is yet. I can't do that.
There you go.
Yep. I can't do that yet. I'm not smart enough yet. I'm not tall enough yet. I don't know how to do that yet.
That's a simple way. That's brilliant, Rocky. That's a really simple way to start to change that bias. I use and. I'm not tall enough yet, and I'm growing to get there. Right? I don't know about that, and I'm learning how. Right? Yet, and anything that adds an expansive statement or an expansive feeling. And I'll tell you, one of the other things to know, we all have different ways that we learn. And by learn, I'm talking about unconscious mind, right? We all have different ways that we learn our bias or learned a different approach to our bias. And that's our senses. Some of us need to see things. Some of us need to hear things. Some of us need to feel things. Some of us need to smell it or taste it, but that generally isn't about bias other than food or, environment. So one of the things you want to do is really understand and pay attention to what is your leading sense. And I actually have a little test I do with clients that I work with to coach and to work on reprogramming their mind and do mind shifting and change their bias. I have a little test I give people, and it'll actually tell you what your primary senses are and what your primary learning mechanism is. But there's a really easy way to know it. When you use your words, do you talk about I need to see it, I need to feel it, I need to touch it, I need to hear it? Listen to your words. And if you use, they're called predicates. If you use I see, I view, etc., you probably need to see it. If you use I feel, I need to touch it, I need to get my hands on it, you're probably kinesthetic. I need to hear it, I need to listen to that. Can you tell me more? You're probably auditory. What you want to do is once you figure out what your primary sense is, then you can accelerate how you change your bias by using that sense. So for example, I'm visual and kinesthetic. So if I want to change a bias, I put in front of myself a written statement and I read it about what the truth is. And I feel the emotion, the feeling of living that truth. If you're somebody that's auditory, you want to record something and listen to it, right? So what you want to do is you want to figure out what your primary sense is and then use that sense to accelerate that change. Whether you're asking questions, whatever you're doing, do it in that more focused within your primary sense, and it goes into your unconscious mind even faster.
That's quite interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So one of the things that I've noticed, and I don't think people realize this, is that marketers, they understand what we're talking about. They've spent an inordinate amount of time understanding human behavior, human psychology. They know your biases, and all of our biases are probably very similar safety biases in a slightly different story, and they know how to poke at them. They know how to turn the switches to get us to feel not enough, to spend our money and give it to them for what they want. And I think one of the classic examples I know is when you change something in your life. For example, if you buy a new house, marketers know that at the moment you've just made that major change in your life, you're susceptible to changing everything. Even your toothpaste brand is open to change at that point because you're open to change. And yet I think there's a lot of us who are stuck, and we can't go buy a new house every day, so we're open to change. But there's got to be simpler ways, right? Are there simpler ways to open us up to change, to fix the triggers that create those safety reactions and prevent us from that?
It's interesting, Rocky. Change, as we define it, any change, even chaos, which, I talk to a lot of business owners and they feel like these are markets. And even though we're in a really, good economy right now. It has the potential for chaos at any moment, right? And there is a lot of chaos around us. Change and chaos are the feeding grounds for us to find opportunity and new innovation and new ways of doing, right? Like your example of, I moved to a new house, so therefore I'm ready to change everything, right? And yet, our bias prevents us from proactively leveraging that change for the breakthrough success that we want, because we don't even realize there are opportunities in our conscious reality. And that's interesting to me, because you say, okay, how do I change the triggers? You don't even know you're being triggered, because that opportunity for change that you could have is filtered out because your unconscious mind doesn't let you see it in your reality. You literally have to be in a position where something is bigger than your fear of change in order for you to do that, right? You have a desire, you have pressure, you have something, right? So, because if you think about it, let's talk a little bit about triggers and change, and then we'll talk about some ideas on how you can start to change those triggers and become more open, change your bias, right? Limit your bias. So let's talk a little bit about change triggers, all right? So I'm going to give you some simple examples, and you'll probably laugh, but simple examples about bias reactions, and we've all seen them, all right? I want you to understand that change is not the Big Bang we think of it. Little tiny changes get the same reaction as the big change does. All right. So here's one of my favorite examples. Have you ever moved somebody's office from a window to an interior office?
I haven't had to move people's offices. No, I've been lucky.
Okay. Well, let me tell you what, when you change somebody's office, where it's from one window to another or in one interior to another, it is like you took their firstborn away. They have so much heart. Not everybody, but a lot of people. It's a huge change. They react so strongly, and yet all you did is you moved them, right? Change your desk around. Here's a little thing I tell my clients to do on an ongoing basis. Here's some examples. Switch your watch to the other arm and feel your body and feel how you react. All you think about is wanting to move it back. Change your desk around. Move your monitor to the other side. Change where things are placed. It will drive you crazy. It will bother you. You will have trouble focusing because your unconscious mind is reacting to that simple a change. You know what I do every month? I change my garbage up from under the sink from one side to the other. Guess how long it takes me before I'm throwing garbage in the right side?
It takes a while, doesn't it?
It takes at least a week. And you know what? I'm uncomfortable with it. And the reason I tell people to try it, change your watch, take a bracelet, take something and reverse it. You will see the power of a small change to trigger the bias reaction in your brain. You will feel it because you will be so uncomfortable, it's not even funny. And yet what you'll also notice is the longer you keep the change in play, the more natural it feels. And as soon as you go back to the way it was, it'll feel unnatural. That shows you the power of change, of tiny changes to trigger the bias response, but it also shows you your power to be able to change that bias over time because you simply experienced the new way. And that's the key right there. What I just said is the key to how you step away from bias. You have to find ways to force your unconscious mind and your literal yourself to step in front of the bias and experience the different way, to step into the different way. And you can't do it directly because you don't even know what happens in most cases, right? You don't know that 99% of the data of the realities you could have got filtered out and you're only living on the same one. It's not a conscious thing. So it doesn't happen consciously that, oh, that was my bias and it just took away that opportunity. You don't know. So you've got to find other ways to get your mind to change, right? And that's some of the techniques that I talk about.
This kind of brings up an interesting question, is if we want to be open to change and doing these things, do we constantly change little things in our life? Like every time we do something, do it differently, whether it's change your desk around, change the background on your screen. Every time you buy toothpaste, buy a different brand, stop at a different coffee shop every day, order something, you just constantly put yourself outside of standard routines, or does that just create chaos?
No, well, it will create chaos because your brain won't like it. You'll feel the discomfort. whether you feel it with emotionally, whether it's your brain getting buzzy, whether it's just uncomfortable, you'll feel it. But I do that all the time, Rocky. I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. How many people, you get up in the morning to go to work. You get up in the morning, you get dressed with the same patterns, you eat breakfast the same way, you drive the same route, et cetera, et cetera. One of the first things I tell people to do is stop that. Everything reorganized every day. It will drive your brain crazy, but it works. And what it does is we all have what's known as neuroplasticity, which is how your brain is able to change and adapt and create new bias, new programs, good and bad, right? So, and we used to think our plasticity ended at 25. We've now learned it never ends. We constantly learn, change, and grow. Our brains constantly adapt. So one of the things you can do is consciously start to not be a creature of habit. That's one of the baselines I tell everybody to do. So, and I do things like that all the time. Because of my life as a consultant, I'm sitting in my office looking out at the beautiful views into Sedona right now, right? I never have my mornings patterned or any of my life patterned the exact same way every day. And I've done that for so long, it's natural to me now. But I really try to make sure I keep it mixed up, because what it causes, here's what happens. If you're not following a pattern, your brain pays more attention. And let me equate that. Let me equate that over to, let's say, take something in business where that occurs. Okay? You want to do that? And I'll give you a technique.
Sure.
Here's a really simple example of repetitive, unchanged behavior in business and how it turns into a bias. Okay? So, reporting. I've been in 300 clients, and you know what? They all have the same basic balance sheet, the same basic revenue pipeline reports, the same basic marketing cost reports, et cetera, right? You've seen them. We all have the same basic formats, right? Well, here's what happens. Your unconscious mind samples. Let's take a pipeline report for sales. So how much, what's my revenue stream look like coming down the pipe? Well, so your brain samples it the first time you see it. And it looks at it again the second time you see it. After the second or third time, and it depends on the person, your brain no longer looks at the report. It simply looks for deltas that are large enough to signal a change that is a threat. Because it's already sampled enough, it thinks it knows what's on the report, and it knows what to expect. So now it's looking for big changes that will cause a threat. Okay, got it? Now, let's say you have a revenue change that's only like 0.5% a month, and it's not big and it's not large, and it happens over 6 months. Have you ever had that point when you suddenly looked at a report or looked at something and went, oh my God, when did that happen? How did I drop 3%? I didn't see that coming. It's because you didn't see it, because your brain didn't see these small changes, the small dips, as big enough to warrant a threat response, and it didn't sample the new data. Now, you want to stop. And by the way, I've never talked to anybody in business that hadn't had that happen. You get blindsided, right? And you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at the information, and suddenly something happens and you're like, where did that come from?
We use that in reverse when it comes to building profit comes first or paying yourself models. What we do is we just tell you to make 0.5% change and suck 0.5% of your money out every month. Because if you suck 0.5% out every month and you slightly make those changes, over the course of a year, you're sucking 6% out, 2 years, 12%, 3 years, 18%, and you never noticed it.
You don't notice it. That's right.
You don't notice it. All of these techniques have the pluses and the minuses to them. You've got to learn to use them to your advantage.
There's a way to avoid the one. I was explaining that, what you just talked about is, you don't notice it. And in that case, it's a positive. But here's an example. And by the way, this isn't that I use reports because everybody in business gets that, because we all look at them. We look at our spreadsheets, et cetera. But it also works in everything you do because you're constantly sampling, right? Your brain samples data. So here's what I tell people to do with the report. And then we'll go out to, I talk about shuffling the deck. Okay. So if you're running reports, you're always running the same report, reformat it every month. When you reformat it every month, your brain has to look at it again. It's not the same repetitive report. And when you start to reformat it and look at it differently, your brain has to sample it every time and you never get blindsided. And by the way, let's talk about a positive way of doing that. How many of us, we have to make a presentation to an owner or a boss, or in my case, a board of directors or whatever, right? And we have these numbers. Have you ever searched through the different graphics to figure out which way presented it in the most positive light?
Oh, yeah, we do that all the time.
We do that all the time. Well, that's shuffling the deck for a positive result. You change the format because you want it to be perceived in a certain way, and certain formats make certain perceptions obvious, right? Well, do the same thing out just constantly. Every time you look at a piece of data, look at it 5 different ways, because when you do that, your brain has to resample every bit of it every time, and you will start to see nuances you never noticed before that will make a tremendous difference in your business and what you see. And the same thing happens when you're looking at things about yourself, about your environment, about your home, about your kids, about your relationships. Find ways to sample differently and experience differently, because that's how, when your brain is forced to retake a look, reevaluate the data, refilter the data, and all of a sudden you get a different result.
And that's very true. Do you have any other techniques that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I do. I have a whole slew of techniques. And here's kind of why I teach these. I have so many techniques, and I picked a few that are really simple. You know, some of them I do one-on-one, like some of the things we've done working together. Some of them I do with, teams, executive teams, with overall companies, as a speaker. But I picked some here that are really easy to do just through audio, right? And here's what I tell people as they start on this, right? The techniques I teach are designed to help you start to filter through your bias. Because the last thing you want to do is, if you're going to start to step out and say, okay, I'm going to face change, I'm going to do something different, you don't want to do it with your bias still in place without tools to handle it, because all will happen is you'll fail because you have your self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You go into a new market that, and you fail. Well, you'll never go back in there again because your bias will take over. Instead, use these techniques before you go into the new market. You're going to try a new job. You're going to try a new approach to whatever. Use the techniques along with the new approach or whatever you're trying new, because otherwise bias will overrule the change you're trying to make and you'll fail. And then you'll go, oh, well, that's just the way it is. How many times have you had that, right? We become the self-fulfilling prophecy, and we talk about patterns. It's because our brains are wired that way and we are chemically driven that way. So you've got to learn how to have your brain change the way it functions, right? Because our bias, I talked about this, our bias creates these realistic stories that we buy into, and that becomes the compass for our beliefs, our decisions, our behaviors, everything about us, right? So you need to learn the key to removing bias or adapting our bias is expanding our perception of what's safe. Expanding our perception of what is truth, what is real, right? Out of the stories we've been programmed to believe that are truth, and the stories we tell repetitively about ourselves, our history, and why we are the way we are, and why things happen the way they happen, you've got to shift from that to what really is. And what really is very different for all of us. Because, 11 million bits a second and we pick 127, there's so many other realities out there, it's not even funny, right? So we can't change the way our mind's designed, but we can change the way our bias works and point it in a different way. So we can get rid of it as guardrails and turn it into ways to find innovation, find ways to be better, find ways to expand and change. And that's what these techniques allow you to do, all right? So first, let's talk about a really simple one, all right? And I know I'm going to jump into this. We talked about, what's an action for the week. I think any of these would be, but the one I'm going to talk about right now is really a good one, all right? So I'm going to put you on the spot, Rocky. Okay. So you have an assumption, and let's say business, right? You make a decision and an assumption about something that's going to be good for your business, right?
Yes.
Now you want to go research that. What do you do when you go out to research?
I go look for facts that agree with my choice and my direction.
Absolutely. You go out and prove yourself right. Correct? You go look for supporting evidence. And we've all been taught that. Well, here's the thing. When I go out to look for supporting evidence, I'm narrowing my focus of what I'm researching and what I'm searching for, right? So instead of looking at the 360-degree horizon of, well, what's out there surrounding this assumption? So let's say, oh, if I go in and do the X, I will receive Y. And the way to do that is through Z. So now I'm only looking at X, Y, and Z, but A through, X are also influential in that environment. But I only look at that 10 degrees instead of that 360 because I'm only looking for the slice of the pie, the slice of the data that proves that I'm right. And by the way, we have an inherent bias in our instinctual wiring that says that we are always right. It's wired into every human being. We assume we're right because otherwise, if we assumed we were wrong, why would we ever walk out the door, right? So instead of going out to prove that assumption right, prove it wrong. Make every time you make an assumption, a decision, have a belief, etc., go research and search for information that is counter to what you believe. Let me tell you what happens. First of all, instead of that 10 or 20 degrees that's towards your agreement, you look at a full 360-degree view and perspective of the data. Second thing that happens is you see other options that you wouldn't have seen if you were only trying to prove yourself right, right? You see all these other options, which may indeed take what you have assumed and make it better. You add value to it. You get more context around it. You get a richer experience and flavor of what surrounds it. So, number 2 is, if you can't find anything to prove yourself wrong, then you really know you're right. And you've gathered all this extra data to make what you've assumed even better. On top of that, when you prove yourself wrong, if you do, you just saved yourself a lot of headache that you would never have saved yourself if you went out to find the evidence to prove yourself right. Because I can tell you, I started out in marketing. There is nothing I can't prove with evidence. I can prove both sides of an equation with evidence. We're all wired to do that. So very rarely do you prove yourself wrong when you're looking for evidence to prove yourself right. But by simply flipping to start to look at, why do I believe that? Why is that true? What are the other options? Where could there be a problem? Where could this be wrong? Instead of, oh, no, that's not relevant. That's not relevant. That's not. Oh, here's something that proves me right. Where do you think you get the better result?
When you prove yourself wrong. And I think that happens a lot in business in a lot of different ventures. And that's why I think people take unnecessary risks because they, as you said, they ignore the risks because they don't think it's a problem.
Now, let's take it another step. I'm in a business. When I first come into a business, I don't have the groupthink and the culture of the way we do it and the truth, right? And by the way, that's why I can walk into a room as a consultant and within 2 hours, I'll see opportunities that everybody in the room hasn't even seen and they think I'm brilliant. I'm not brilliant. I'm just not programmed with bias yet, right? I just don't have their biases. You come into a business and you're programmed with, this is what we do, this is how we work, this is who our customers are, this is our value, this is our competition, this is why they're not, all of those things, right? So now you make a decision in business. And it's been created not only by you think, and you go out to prove it right. Well, the fundamental of the business was already based on a very tiny piece of reality because you've been programmed into the bias. Right? I know this is true. I know what I do. I know why I'm good. I know how my business runs. I know why my customers buy me. I know all these things and I'm building off of that. Well, if you start to prove yourself wrong, what you also learn is that a lot of those assumptions that you've been programmed with about your business are wrong too. Right? So what we end up doing is we build on bias after bias after bias and turn into these self-fulfilling prophecies. And then we wonder why we didn't see that opportunity that somebody else took away from us and walked in when it was right in front of our faces.
That is very true. And it's also why I think when people make changes in their life, they get upset that no one's noticing the changes. And it's because everyone else is biased that you're a certain way and they don't see the change that you made. So it takes a while.
Absolutely. You know what? I really resonate with that one because let me tell you what, the person who I was in my 30s and 40s before I got into this work, actually before I had a pretty life-changing event and realized why I was the way I was, which drove me into this work to save myself. My nickname was Robo Babe. I had a bias that had created a persona around it that was, I was in danger constantly. I was powerless and I was in danger. And that bias created this persona around me that was a swaggering witch. Seriously, terrifying. I mean, bully, you name it. And people that knew me in my younger years before I understood why I was the way I was and literally transformed it, still filter based on what they knew me as then instead of who I am today. Completely. And you see that a lot. You see it with kids. I see it with people in business. You see it in relationships. You talked about why a wife can tell a husband something and he doesn't hear it, but the neighbor does. It's because that relationship has been through so many realities that the bias has been around who and what that wife is and who that husband is. And the roles and the communication and the conversation and the filtering of the data is based on where it was at some past point in time versus today. Because the filtering is not around what's really happening today. It's around all the history. Does that make sense?
Total sense. Absolutely.
I'll give you an example. Women, and this isn't a positive example, Rocky, but it's a really great example. Women will swear they never even thought their husband was cheating on them, right? Or men will swear they never even imagined their wife was cheating on them. And yet, when it first happens, and yet you talk to them a year or two later after they're out of that bias of that relationship, and what do they tell you? Well, I guess I should have seen him coming because this happened and then this was occurring and this was occurring, but they couldn't see it in the moment because their bias was filtering based on expectation.
Very true.
But have you heard that?
Oh, many times. Many
times, right? I do a lot of work with people with PTSD or trauma or, that have been through those kinds of experiences and or much worse, right? And it's amazing to me that one of the things that people do is they beat up on themselves because they'll say, I should have seen it coming. After I was out of it, I saw this, this, and this. Well, they couldn't see that, and that because their brain wasn't filtering. It was deleting it because it wasn't what their brain saw as relevant information. Their brain saw it as a threat because, oh my God, if that's true, it's a change and I can't handle it, so I'm going to delete it. And then we blame ourselves when in fact it's our wiring. And it's in our, I always say we're humans in business, right? And I know that's a catchphrase, but for me, it's even deeper. Our brains, the way we are wired as humans, around bias, around what happens unconsciously before we're ever even conscious of anything, that filters our lives, our personal perception of ourselves, our relationships, our business interactions, our business sense, everything about us is about this wiring. And what blows my mind, and I know I say that a lot, but what blows my mind is we don't know it. Neuroscience is figuring it out. The ancient esoteric, believe it or not, the ancient esoteric sciences, alchemy is based on what I'm telling you. The ancients, the philosophers, etc., knew this. We've proven it with science now, right? So, and we all have the power to change it. It's just the techniques. So things like proving yourself wrong. if you take somebody in a business, one of the exercises I do when I go into clients, because I do a lot of work with management teams or clients is that are stuck, right? Their markets are, their revenue's flat, or they're looking to go into a new market or whatever, and they just can't see why. And one of the exercises I do is I have them take everything they believe to be true about their business and prove it wrong. And guess what? You'd be amazed at what they find that truly is no longer relevant and accurate, but it has just been accepted because it's the way the bias has been created within the culture of the business, right? And that brings me to another technique. So the other thing you can do is you can shift your bias, okay? So, and the way, the way you shift your bias is, let's take, for example, we've all heard of status quo bias, right? The drive to take you back to the status quo, which is what I talk about as a drive to safety, and it's much broader than just status quo. But literally have somebody, I also call this play stump the chump, all right? And I'm usually the chump. I will take one of the status quo biases, beliefs known about the business that is absolutely, everybody in the room will say, this is true, right? And I will stand in front of the room and I will present that as true. And I will have everybody in that room start to talk about flipping it, why it's false, asking me questions to prove it wrong, making statements that are counter to what I'm saying. What it does is it takes an independent, instead of you having to fight it, you're doing it to somebody else that's not you. And what it does is it literally starts to show your bias, that the bias that it believes is not true. That the status quo. I'll give you an example. What happens in a lot of companies is, okay, I'm going to go try this new way. And it may be a new market, a new way of selling, a new way of marketing, a new way of whatever, right? New product, whatever. And I go in and I start it, and you know what? I fail. It doesn't work. And so what do? As soon as it starts to fail and it's uncomfortable because it's different, I run back to the way I used to do it, right? Well, the challenge is that who knows why it failed. Maybe you didn't give it enough time. Maybe you didn't give it enough of an opportunity to, maybe you didn't spend enough time to really refine it and understand it because you got so uncomfortable because it wasn't working exactly the way you want that you ran it back. So what I'll do is I'll take that example. Let's take an example of a market. I had a client. Here's a good example. I had a client that went into a market, failed miserably. And when I came in there, one of the first things I said to them was, this is a really great market for you. And they went, oh, no, we tried that. We can't go back in there. Well, I looked at them and I said, well, what do you mean you can't go back in there? Why? Oh, because of this, this, and this. And they were absolutely adamant about why they failed and that it was not a good opportunity for them. So what we did was we did an exercise where we said, okay, let's take a look at this market again, and let's look at it from why you failed. But rather than why you failed, what you could do to change what happened when you failed in order to be successful. And it took them it really took the team about an hour to get there because they had all just been bruised by that failure. And then what started to happen is suddenly one of the leaders said, well, wait a minute, you know what? Have you guys noticed that when we went in, this, and this weren't happening yet, and now they are? And then somebody else jumped in and went, yeah, and you know what? Because of that's happening, we could have done this, this, and this. And because of not hitting it straight on, because they looked at at why it happened, but instead of looking at why we failed, we looked at what's different, what could have been done differently, what's changed. We're not looking at the failure. We're looking at the side of it. All of a sudden, they figured out, you know what we figured out? They went into the market a few years early, and one of the major things that needed to be in place before they could be successful was not in place. And it was at that current time. And just by recognizing that, suddenly they had a different piece of information. They had a whole different perspective on what they could do. And they stepped back in and started brainstorming. They proved that they were wrong about why they couldn't, proved saw new information and started to come up with new ways to be right. And long story short, we got them in the market and they took off, and they literally doubled their business within the next 18 months because of the success.
That's amazing.
From a failure. But if you think about it, they proved themselves wrong. They asked questions. They went around it. So you've got to use all of these together, right? It really is about tricking your brain, Rocky. It's about tricking your mind because your mind is constantly learning. So, I talk about the biases in the programs. Well, we learn a lot of them that create our basic fundamental personality and our belief system about who and what we are in the world and what's true and false before, we're like 8. But then we continue to learn constantly. So the key is to put yourself in scenarios where you learn that what you believe to be a threat, what your bias has told you as a guardrail, what is your reactions, your brain starts to see different things. That causes it to sample again, see different things, and literally what you focus on is what your unconscious mind starts to program as your bias, as your program. So all of these tools together, like what you talked about, should you start to, do things that are different, change your patterns, etc. Absolutely. I call that getting out of your comfort zone. Simply by changing something in your world every day, whether it be personally, the order you get dressed, the way you brush your teeth, the type of toothpaste, the breakfast you have, how you drive to work, what you do when you get to your office, how your office is organized, all of those things. Constant change gets your brain ready and able to start to change, right? In business, what do we all do when we want to look for new ideas? We all go look at our competition, right? We go look at the competitors. We go look and see what's cool's going on. We research our market and see what the pundits are saying and all that. Well, here's another idea. Go look someplace out of your market. Completely, totally, nothing to do with what you do. If you're selling B2B, go look at consumer retail. If you're selling technology, go look at cosmetics. I don't care. Get outside your comfort zone because your comfort zone is where your bias lives and where your threats and everything else live. Some of the best ideas my clients have is when I send them off to go look at markets that have nothing to do with what they do. I had a client that was in high tech, and he literally was talking to some of his friends that he plays golf with who are lawyers and dentists. So here's an example. I had a client, a CEO. I told him, I said, get outside of your market. Get outside of all the buddies that do exactly what you do and talk to people who know nothing about what you do and what your business is, but who have their own businesses, and talk to them about what they do to solve the kind of problems you're talking about or to get ideas or whatever. So he plays golf with a lawyer and a dentist and who knows who else. So he took me seriously, and he went out and he started to talk to all his different friends who were in totally different kinds of business models, structures, you name it, different audiences, different everything. And he came back to me about a month later and said, oh my God, I got the best ideas. Well, and here's the thing. First of all, he was able to hear the ideas because they weren't threats, because they weren't in his context. So the dentist telling him how he did billing with patients was not, and his being different was not a threat to him about his billing systems because it's a different market. It's not even the same context. So it wasn't like it was attacking what he does that he has to hold on to, right? How somebody else goes out and does marketing and captures new prospects was not a threat to the way he does it because it wasn't a comparison. It was a totally different context. When you get out of your context into different contexts, your brain opens, you get open-minded, and it's willing to hear the different ideas. Then when you bring the different ideas in, instead of letting your brain go, oh, no, that won't work, prove yourself wrong that it won't work. Take the new idea and start to look at it, start to evaluate it, ask yourself questions around it. Try to prove it wrong, but at the same time, try to prove your idea you can't do it wrong. And guess what? Your brain opens, you get a 360 perspective. The way you filter all that data starts to change. And once you have that 360 perspective and your brain is taking in and actually evaluating the data fresh, et voila, innovation happens and you take advantage of the opportunities and change instead of literally deleting them.
And that's amazing. And I think that's what it is. When we look at things through different lenses, the world changes and opportunities open up and the incredible can happen.
And the key is to understand how to get those lenses changed. We've all been taught this backwards, we're logical and our conscious mind rules and we should be in control. That is not the reality, right? And it's the lenses or perceptions, perspectives, however you want to talk about it. I talk a lot about safety lenses because we put safety lenses on and that filters our data about, to make us safe. But it is changing simple lenses. And, you and I had a conversation before we started that fits into this. We were about reacting to people, to statements, to whatever, and being, trying not to go, but, wait a minute, being frustrated, right? And a simple lens change, like we talked, is from going from being frustrated about something to being fascinated about it. So instead of being frustrated about the person who has a totally different belief and perspective than you do and trying to counter that, get fascinated with why they have that perspective. That simple change in the way you ask your brain to perceive things changes everything about the way you process the data. Because instead of sitting there thinking about how you're going to prove you're right and how you're going to counter them, you start to learn more. You get a broader perspective. You expand to a 360 view of how they came to believe what they believe, whether you agree with it or not. When the opening to new information, new ideas, opportunities, etc., even expanding on your own beliefs and altering them, that's how that happens.
Very true. Is there anything else you wanted to share on the subject of living a more powerful life but didn't get a chance to?
One of the things that I have as a guidance system for myself now is be easy on yourself. We've all been programmed that we are these humans with these conscious, logical, rational thinking mind and this brain that separates us from the animals, and we should be in control. We should be able to handle it. We should. You know what? We are wired more than any of us recognize. It's more than even science knows today. We are wired and it's all for good reasons, but the wiring really controls us so much more than we know. And when we get easy with ourselves and start to laugh at ourselves, one of the first things I really learned to do was laugh at some of the stuff that was embedded in me. And it came from horrible, I was a horribly abused child from the time I was 4 till I was 14. And it was so bad. I mean, badly tortured, you name it. And I blocked the memories until I was 50 years old. And I couldn't understand why I was such a fighter and felt powerless and alone and all of this. Well, it totally made sense once I knew it. But, I had to start to really be gentle with myself, because what I realized was that a lot of who I was and my triggered reactions were from a programming and a wiring that was so inherent in me that it wasn't going to change overnight. It wasn't going to release overnight. It was a journey and an exploration and adventure to find my truth, not beating myself up because I was a mess, right? Or beating myself up because I learned about the biases. I learned about the things that triggered me. I learned about the beliefs that were just plain wrong about myself, about the world, about opportunity, about money, about everything, right? Be kind to yourself and laugh a lot, because we are all subject to this. We are all the products of our environment. We are all the products of our biases. And you know what? It's one day at a time, it's one day at a time, but you got to take it with a grain of salt and a lot of laughter and be kind.
That is very true. It's time to learn the secrets of life. What's your secret to living a powerful life?
Knowing that I control and define every single piece of my reality. Every single piece. I recognize that everything that manifests in my life is a result of my focus, my expectation, my thoughts, and my words. And they aren't in the present. It's probably from the past, but I am not a victim. My world is not something that happens to me I select my reality. I select the data. I create the biases, right? I control my world. I am a quantum machine. I am a quantum computer, and I can choose. And based on how I think, what I focus on, what I think about, and what I say, I create the reality and I create my power. And I can either choose to believe that and do that, or I can choose to be a victim. And I choose to control and I choose to create my own reality. And that creates my power.
You've conquered the reflection in the mirror.
I wouldn't say conquered. I'd say it's an ongoing, every day, every moment journey. Because if you think I don't have negative thoughts, we all do. I mean, the programming's so deep. But, what I've learned is I catch myself. I laugh a lot. I laugh at some of the stuff that pops up, especially when you're tired. The old AA has a thing about tired. What is it? HALT, right? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Isn't that what it is, as I remember? Any of those things also trigger you to go into negative thinking. And you know what? One of the best things I've learned is that when I catch myself in a negative thought or a grumpy thought, oh God, I can't do that. And I wish I had that. And I'll never have that. I catch myself. And the first thing I do is I laugh. The second thing I do is I say, unconscious mind, that's so silly. That's not true at all. The reality is, and whatever the counter was to whatever negativity I had, I state that, I step into it, I believe it, and I move on, because that's how you reprogram. You're not going to stop the negative thoughts. You're not going to stop the petty parties, the whatever, but you can laugh at them and pivot and retrain your unconscious mind to think they're ridiculous and funny and move on. And that's the key right there, Rocky. That's been my key.
What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
That I'm in control of my life.
And that's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Rocky, I'll tell you, it was really interesting because anybody that knew me when I was RoboBabe would have told you I had more power than anything they ever knew. And I would have told you that too. What I didn't know is that as a child, literally, I was locked in a basement that was a torture chamber waiting for them to come for me, right? As a child, I was taught I was powerless because that's what the abuse was all about. It was to make me powerless. And I had this unbelievably ingrained belief that I was powerless. And that was what really caused me to create RoboBabe, to protect me from the powerlessness, right? So it was a flip side of, I'm going to be out there as RoboBabe charging rebel, right? The big bad rebel. And in fact, internally, I totally believed I had no power in my world whatsoever, that the world did things to me. And I wish, and you know what? The universe gave me experience after experience to be able to recover the memories sooner. I got stood up at the altar when I was 21. I had bad relationships all of my life that got more and more horrible. And none of them were big enough to bring up the memories because the memories were so deeply buried. And I wish I'd have learned sooner what I know now, which is that I control my reality in my life. We all do. I wish I'd have learned that either. I wish everybody in this planet knew that.
What's one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Let it go.
That's a big one.
But it is. Let it go. Laugh more often. I followed my dream, so I can't say that. I climbed mountains all over the world. I dove the deepest oceans. I had the life that people just look at me and go, how did you do all that? So I had the adventure, but you know what? I would tell myself to just let it go. That when things happen that aren't what I expected or that aren't what I wanted or that somebody didn't like me for some reason, just let it go. It's not that important. In the scheme of things, and I think we all do this as we get older, maybe, Rocky. You look back at the things you worried about when you were young, and it seems so insignificant.
I'm working on that one, too.
Yeah, the level of angst and worry and with the world around us, with what other people think, with what's happening externally to us, doesn't matter. It all comes from who we are, what we're focusing, and what we expect inside. And if we focus and if we really just let go of everything around us and just focus on what we want, what we expect, what our dreams are, and knowing that we can do it, and forget public opinion and other people's opinions and, all the naysayers that come into our life. There's too many naysayers in this world. Everybody wants to keep you limited. Ignore it. Let it go. Step into your power and accept it, because we were all born Look at babies and when your kids learn to walk, et cetera. They are fearless. They do not know they can't. They do not know they are limited. They have power. That's how we all should live our lives for the entire duration of our life, because that's what we were destined to be.
Absolutely. If people would like to learn more about you, find you, and connect, what's the best way for them to do that?
I am Rebel Brown on LinkedIn. I'm Rebel Brown on Facebook. My website is rebelbrown.com. My email is rebel@rebelbrown.com. So if you just go for Rebel Brown, you'll find me.
That's cool. And I will put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me. This was an awesome conversation.
As always, Rocky, it was a pleasure. I love working with you.
That was an amazing conversation. Once you understand how your subconscious works and how the programming and wiring is designed, you start to see why you and others behave the way you do. Then you can start to question everything and start to tear down beliefs that don't serve you well. There are many rules in life that are made up. You really have to question them all. Why do you have to do things the way you do? Just because that's the way it's done doesn't mean that that's the way it has to be. You have the power to change and control where you are going. You create your power and reality, and sometimes you need help. This week's action step: find information that proves what you're thinking is wrong. I'm working on this one. I question everything these days. We have to challenge all those negative voices in people and decide to change. It helps to have support, whether it's mentors, books, coaches, masterminds, friends. Help comes in so many different ways, and it's literally right in front of you. Believe it's there and look for it, and it will appear. Are you living your dream like Rebel is? It's possible. You have so much more power than you can imagine. Start to harness it and use it. If you're still listening, you must have liked the episode. So please share it with a few friends, and if you get a chance, leave a review. I'd appreciate that. You can also connect with me on Facebook. There's a Facebook page and a Facebook group for Richer Soul. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Can I help you achieve your goals through coaching and accountability? Just email me, and we can start with a short chat to see if we're a good fit for coaching. For many people, one session allows them to take a giant leap forward towards their dreams. You can reach me at rocky@richersoul.com. I'd love to hear how you're doing and how the information I have shared has helped you. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.